The wedding photographs looked perfect. Smiles frozen in black and white, tuxedos sharply pressed, veils delicately arranged, hands gently touching just enough to suggest love. Hollywood sold these images as fairy tales, proof that fame, beauty, and romance naturally belong together. But behind the camera, behind the studio press releases and glowing magazine spreads, many of these marriages were not born from passion. They were born from fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of losing everything. Fear of being erased by an industry that demanded perfection but punished truth. Old Hollywood did not just create stars, it created lies so convincing that even the people living them sometimes forgot where the performance ended and real life began. This is the story of lavender marriages, unions designed to hide forbidden love, protect careers, and preserve illusions. These were not always cold arrangements. Some were built on friendship, loyalty, and quiet understanding. Others were emotional prisons that destroyed lives from the inside. And some, most disturbingly, blurred the line between deception and devotion in ways that still haunt Hollywood history today. Imagine being adored by millions but unable to hold the hand of the person you truly loved in public. Imagine being celebrated as a romantic icon while your real heart was forced to live in the shadows. In the golden age of Hollywood, this was not rare. It was standard procedure. The studios called it image management. The gossip columnists called it discretion. The actors themselves called it survival. Rock Hudson was one of the most beloved leading men of his era. Tall, handsome, with a jawline sculpted as if it were designed by MGM itself, he was marketed as the embodiment of American masculinity. Women swooned over him. Fan letters poured in by the thousands. Magazine covers promised he was the kind of man every woman dreamed of marrying. And yet, the greatest love of Rock Hudson's life was something he was forbidden to acknowledge. From the moment he signed his studio contract, Rock knew the rules. His sexuality was not just personal, it was dangerous. The studio executives made it clear, one rumor could end everything. Roles would vanish. Contracts would dissolve. His name would be quietly replaced by someone younger, straighter, and more obedient. So when whispers began circulating, when a gossip columnist threatened to print what everyone in certain circles already knew, the studio panicked. The solution came swiftly and without romance. A marriage. Phyllis Gates was young, elegant, and ambitious. She understood Hollywood's unspoken bargains. When she agreed to marry Rock Hudson, it wasn't because she was deeply in love. It was because the studio needed her, and she needed the opportunity. Their wedding was lavish. The press celebrated it as proof that Rock Hudson was finally settling down. Headlines called it a love match. Friends toasted their future. Cameras captured smiles that looked real enough. But inside their home, the truth was devastatingly different. Rock tried to play the role of a devoted husband. He wanted to be kind. He wanted to make it work. But kindness could not replace desire, and performance could not create intimacy. Phyllis began to realize that her marriage was not just lonely, it was staged. The man she married cared for her, protected her, but did not love her in the way she had been promised. As the months passed, the silence between them grew heavier. Phyllis reportedly discovered letters, evidence of Rock's private life, confirmation of what she had suspected but perhaps hoped was untrue. The betrayal cut deeply, not because Rock had secrets, but because she had been asked to sacrifice real love for a lie that benefited everyone except her. Their marriage lasted less than 3 years. When Phyllis finally left, she didn't just lose a husband. She lost her standing. The studio turned cold. Doors quietly closed. Hollywood had no sympathy for women who disrupted its illusions. Rock Hudson, meanwhile, returned to his carefully maintained image, carrying guilt, relief, and a lifetime of silence. Years later, when Rock Hudson publicly revealed his AIDS diagnosis shortly before his death, the world was shocked. Hollywood mourned him. But few acknowledged the decades of emotional imprisonment that had preceded that moment. His Lavender marriage was not a scandal, it was a symptom of an industry built on repression. But Rock Hudson's story was not unique. Long before him, another actor lived inside an even more dangerous secret. Ramon Novarro was one of the first true Latin heartthrobs of Hollywood. In the silent film era, his beauty was legendary. His eyes were soft, his presence magnetic, his screen romances intoxicating. He was worshipped by fans who saw him as the ultimate exotic leading man. But behind closed doors, Ramon lived in constant terror. Unlike later eras, there was no room for negotiation in the 1920s. Homosexuality was not merely frowned upon, it was career suicide. Worse, it was considered immoral, criminal, something that could justify violence. Ramon's studio worked relentlessly to craft a heterosexual image for him, pairing him with actresses, staging photo ops, inventing romances. But rumors persisted. To protect him, the studio arranged relationships meant to quiet suspicion. Women were placed beside him, not as lovers but as shields. These arrangements were not always formal marriages, but they functioned the same way, public displays designed to smother truth. What makes Ramon Novarro's story particularly haunting is how deeply isolated he became. Unlike some actors who found comfort in discreet communities, Ramon retreated inward. He feared exposure so intensely that he distanced himself from almost everyone. The loneliness consumed him. As his career declined with the arrival of sound films, the protection faded. Studios no longer needed him. The system that once hid his secret abandoned him without mercy. In his later years, Ramon lived quietly, far from the spotlight that had once adored him. His death was brutal and tragic, murdered in his own home by men who reportedly targeted him believing he was wealthy. But many historians believe his isolation made him vulnerable. A lifetime of secrecy had left him alone when he needed protection most. Hollywood never acknowledged its role. As one story faded, another quietly took its place. Cary Grant is remembered as the epitome of charm, effortlessly suave, endlessly romantic, the man who redefined screen masculinity. He married multiple times, each relationship widely publicized, each divorce scrutinized. But what the public never fully understood was how carefully constructed his personal life truly was. Before he became Cary Grant, he was Archie Leach, a man navigating his identity in a world that offered no safety for honesty. His early years in Hollywood were marked by close relationships with men, friendships so intense they raised eyebrows even in a town used to whispers. The studios noticed. Marriage, once again, became the solution. Cary Grant's marriages were real on paper, but emotionally complicated. Some wives reportedly sensed something was missing, something unspoken. Others may have understood more than history records. What remains undeniable is that these unions provided stability for his image while allowing him to continue living parts of his truth in carefully hidden ways. Unlike Rock Hudson, Cary Grant managed to survive Hollywood without complete emotional collapse. But survival came at a cost. Repeated marriages, repeated divorces, repeated attempts to fit into a role that never fully belonged to him. The question lingers, how many of those relationships failed because they were never meant to succeed? As the studio system tightened its grip, Lavender marriages became less about love and more about damage control. Women became collateral. Men became prisoners of their own fame. And the audience, unaware, adoring, helped reinforce the illusion with every ticket purchased, every fan letter written. And yet, amid the lies, something unexpected sometimes emerged. Not passion, not desire, but companionship. Some Lavender marriages evolved into genuine friendships. Quiet alliances built on mutual protection. Two people against a ruthless machine. These relationships complicate the narrative, reminding us that not all deception was cruel. Sometimes it was the only kindness available. But kindness does not erase pain. And the next story proves that even friendship could not save everyone. Because when the studio decided you were expendable, no marriage, Lavender or otherwise, could protect you. She was never meant to be famous. That is the part Hollywood conveniently erased. The women in Lavender marriages are often treated as footnotes, as props in men's stories, as willing participants in deception. But many of them were neither naive nor heartless. Some were deeply human, women who agreed to sacrifice their own chance at real love because the system left them with no honorable alternative. One of those women stepped into history quietly, without fanfare, and carried a secret so heavy it bent the rest of her life around it. Katharine Hepburn never needed a man to make her famous. That alone made her dangerous. She spoke differently, dressed differently, moved through Hollywood with a confidence that unsettled studio executives who preferred their actresses pliable and predictable. Rumors followed her almost from the start, not because of scandalous behavior, but because she refused to perform femininity the way the industry demanded. Her closest relationship, the one that shaped her emotional life most deeply, was not with a husband but with Spencer Tracy. Their bond was intense, passionate, and famously complicated. What the public didn't know, or chose not to examine too closely, was that this relationship functioned as a kind of mutual cover. Tracy, a married man who never divorced, and Hepburn, a woman whose independence fueled endless speculation, became each other's alibi. This was not a Lavender marriage in the traditional sense. There were no vows, no wedding photographs, but it operated under the same logic. Appear together. Deflect questions. Protect reputations. The studios allowed it because it worked. Katharine Hepburn never publicly married again. She never needed to. Her partnership with Tracy was enough to silence gossip, enough to keep the system satisfied. But behind that public arrangement lived a woman who spent decades loving someone she could never fully claim. And behind that love was an industry that found it easier to tolerate emotional limbo than truth. Her story reminds us of something essential. Lavender marriages were not always legal contracts. Sometimes they were emotional ones, relationships designed to absorb scrutiny so secrets could remain buried. And secrecy was the currency of survival. By the 1950s, the machinery of concealment had become highly efficient. Studios maintained files on actors' private lives. Publicists monitored bars, parties, phone calls. Careers could be destroyed not by scandal itself, but by the threat of it. In this environment, lavender marriages became a formalized solution, recommended, arranged, enforced. Tab Hunter was young, beautiful, and wildly popular. His face graced countless fan magazines. Teen girls plastered his image on bedroom walls. He was the kind of star studios dreamed of controlling, and the kind they feared losing. Tab Hunter was also gay. From the moment he signed his contract, his private life became a studio problem. Dates with women were scheduled. Photos were staged. Interviews were scripted. But the whispers would not stop. When a particularly dangerous rumor surfaced, one that could not be laughed off, the studio intervened decisively. A relationship was arranged. Not out of romance, but necessity. Tab later described the experience with heartbreaking clarity. He did not hate the women he was paired with. In many cases, he respected them deeply. But the constant performance, the endless pretending, was exhausting. Every smile felt borrowed. Every public appearance was a reminder that authenticity was forbidden. What makes Tab Hunter's story especially haunting is how close he came to losing everything anyway. Arrest records, buried scandals, near exposures, each incident tightened the noose. The studio system did not protect him out of kindness. It protected him because he was profitable. When that profitability faded, so did the protection. Unlike Ramon Novarro, Tab Hunter lived long enough to see a different world. He eventually told his story openly, reclaiming the truth Hollywood stole from him. But the scars remained. Decades of silence do not disappear simply because honesty becomes possible. And then there are the stories that never received redemption. Stories where the performance never ended, not even in death. One of the cruelest ironies of lavender marriages is that they often required the most emotional labor from those with the least power. Wives who absorbed suspicion. Partners who deflected rumors. Women who endured humiliation so men could continue to exist safely. Some knew the truth from the beginning. Others discovered it slowly, painfully, through absence, coldness, or confession. And once they knew, they faced an impossible choice: maintain the lie or destroy two lives at once. Hollywood offered no support for women who chose honesty. Divorce was dangerous. Speaking out was unthinkable. Silence was the price of survival. Many of these women lived their entire lives guarding secrets they did not create. They watched their husbands become legends while their own sacrifices went unacknowledged. History rarely names them. Fan magazines never thank them. But without them, the illusion would have collapsed. And that illusion, the illusion of perfect love, was everything. Audiences wanted fairy tales. Studios sold them relentlessly. The idea that the most romantic men on screen were living loveless or hidden lives was too unsettling to confront. So the lie persisted, polished and protected, decade after decade. Until the weight of it became unbearable. As the studio system began to crack in the late 1950s and 60s, the carefully arranged marriages started to unravel. Actors gained more control. The public grew more skeptical. Scandals became harder to bury. The old rules no longer guaranteed safety. Some stars escaped. Others didn't. Rock Hudson's final years forced Hollywood to confront a truth it had spent decades denying. The man they sold as the ultimate romantic lead had been denied the right to love openly. His lavender marriage, once praised as wholesome, was revealed as a cage. The industry mourned him, but it did not apologize. And that may be the most shocking truth of all. Lavender marriages were not accidents. They were policy. They were the result of an industry that valued image over humanity, profit over people. These unions were not about deception for deception's sake. They were about survival in a system that offered no mercy. But survival has consequences. Lives fragmented. Love delayed. Truth buried so deeply it reshaped identities. Some actors never learned who they might have been without the performance. And yet, within these stories of repression, there is also resilience. Friendships that endured. Quiet loyalties that lasted decades. Love that existed even when it could not be named. Because even in the most controlled environments, humanity finds a way to breathe. And now, as we approach the final story, we confront the most painful question of all. What happens when the lie outlives the people who told it? The photographs still exist. They sit in archives, in coffee table books, in framed displays at Hollywood museums, bride and groom smiling under chandeliers, confetti frozen mid-air, tuxedos and gowns glowing beneath studio lights. These images were never meant to age. They were meant to last forever, proof that Hollywood love was real, attainable, and flawless. But photographs lie better than people. They don't show the silence after the cameras leave. They don't capture the separate bedrooms, the rehearsed affection, the conversations that never happened because honesty was too dangerous. By the time the golden age of Hollywood began to crumble, the damage had already been done. For many stars, the lie became so normalized that they lost the ability to imagine a different life. Years of performance blurred into identity. Public marriages replaced private truth. And in some cases, even the actors themselves could no longer tell whether what they felt was real or merely the echo of a role repeated too often. George C. Scott was never packaged as a romantic lead in the traditional sense. He was intense, volatile, brilliant, a man whose power came from his unpredictability. Yet even he could not escape the studio system's obsession with image. His personal life was chaotic, filled with marriages that burned bright and ended painfully. While his story does not fit neatly into the traditional Lavender marriage framework, it reflects the same emotional violence inflicted by an industry that demanded conformity at all costs. Hollywood did not care who you loved. It cared who people believed you loved. And belief was everything. One of the most tragic truths about Lavender marriages is that many of them began with hope. Not romantic hope, but hope for safety. Hope that the arrangement would be temporary. Hope that one day the world would change fast enough to justify patience. It rarely did. Some actors spent their entire lives waiting for a future that arrived only after they were gone. Others tried to reclaim their truth too late. The women involved, often younger, often less powerful, paid a different price. They were judged harshly when marriages failed. Blamed for men's unhappiness. Labeled difficult, frigid, or unstable. Their side of the story rarely mattered. The machine moved on. And when the public finally began to glimpse the truth, the reaction was not always compassion. Revelations about old Hollywood's hidden lives shocked audiences not because they were immoral, but because they shattered the fantasy. People didn't want to admit they had been complicit. That they had rewarded a system that demanded silence. That their appetite for perfect love stories helped sustain a culture of fear. Lavender marriages force us to confront an uncomfortable reality. These unions were not rare exceptions. They were foundational to Hollywood's success. The Golden Age was built on secrets. But secrets are heavy things. They warp the people who carry them. And in some cases, they destroy them. Ramon Novarro died alone. Rock Hudson died knowing the world finally saw him, but only at the end. Tab Hunter lived long enough to tell the truth, but not long enough to erase the years he lost. Katharine Hepburn carried her privacy like armor, refusing to explain herself to an industry that never deserved an explanation. Each story is different. Each pain unique. But the pattern is unmistakable. Hollywood demanded love on screen and denial of it. And the audience applauded. Now, decades later, we look back with a mixture of fascination and grief. It is easy to romanticize secrecy. Easy to frame Lavender marriages as clever arrangements, elegant solutions to a difficult era. But doing so risks minimizing the cost. These were lives constrained by fear. Hearts disciplined into silence. Truth treated as a liability. Yet there is something profoundly human in these stories, something that transcends scandal. Because beneath the contracts and cover stories, people still reached for connection. They found friendship where romance was impossible. Loyalty where passion was forbidden. In some Lavender marriages, a quiet respect grew, a mutual recognition of shared captivity. That does not make the system kind. It makes the people resilient. The final truth about old Hollywood's Lavender marriages is not that they were deceptive. It is that they were necessary in a world that refused to allow honesty. And necessity does not absolve cruelty, it explains it. As the last of the Golden Age stars faded from the screen, a new Hollywood emerged. Louder, messier, more honest. Not perfect, but freer. Actors began to speak. Stories once buried surfaced. The illusion cracked. And through those cracks, truth finally breathed. So the next time you see an old wedding photo, or watch a black and white romance unfold on screen, remember this: love was still there. It just wasn't allowed to be seen. These were not loveless people. They were silenced ones. And their stories matter, not because they were scandalous, but because they remind us what happens when a society demands performance over authenticity. Old Hollywood asked its stars to be everything, except themselves. And they paid the price quietly, beautifully, and far too often, alone. If these stories moved you, stay with them. Share them. Because remembering is the one thing secrecy can never survive. And perhaps, in telling these truths now, we give those hidden loves the ending they were always denied. Lavender marriages did not end when the contracts expired, when the studios collapsed, or when the stars died. Their echoes are still with us. They live in the way Hollywood learned to control narratives, in the way public images are still curated, in the way truth is often delayed until it is safe, or profitable, to reveal. What changed was not the instinct to hide, but the cost of being exposed. For decades, old Hollywood asked its brightest stars to live as symbols instead of people. And many of them agreed, not because they were weak, but because the alternative was annihilation. To love openly meant losing everything they had worked for. To tell the truth meant being erased. So they chose survival, even when it meant marrying strangers, performing affection, and burying their hearts where no camera could find them. And here is the most haunting part: some of them fell in love anyway. Not in the way movies promised. Not in sweeping kisses or grand declarations. But in quieter ways, in loyalty, in shared silence, in protecting one another from a world that would not forgive honesty. Some lavender marriages became partnerships. Some became friendships deeper than romance. Others collapsed under the weight of pretending. All of them left marks that fame could not heal. When we talk about Rock Hudson, we talk about tragedy. When we talk about Ramon Novarro, we talk about loss. When we talk about Tab Hunter, we talk about survival. When we talk about Katharine Hepburn, we talk about defiance. When we talk about Cary Grant, we talk about reinvention. But what ties them together is not scandal. It is courage. Courage to endure a world that demanded silence. Courage to keep going when authenticity was forbidden. Courage to exist at all. These were not perfect people. They were not flawless icons. They were human beings navigating an industry that treated truth as a threat. And perhaps the most romantic thing about their stories is not who they married, but how fiercely they protected the parts of themselves that Hollywood tried to erase. So when the screen fades to black, when the credits roll on those old films, remember this: the love you didn't see mattered just as much as the love you did. The stories hidden between the frames are just as real as the ones scripted for applause. Old Hollywood sold dreams. But behind those dreams were people who paid dearly to keep them alive. And now, decades later, the secret is no longer theirs to carry alone. If this story stayed with you, if it changed the way you see those glamorous images and perfect smiles, then their silence was not in vain. Because truth, once spoken, has a way of finally setting history free. And sometimes, the most powerful love stories are the ones that were never allowed to be told, until now, and yet, even now, there is one last layer to confront. Because it's tempting to look back at lavender marriages as relics of a cruel, outdated era. To reassure ourselves that this kind of sacrifice belongs safely in the past. But the truth is more uncomfortable. What old Hollywood perfected was not just secrecy, it was control. Control over narrative. Control over identity. Control over what the public was allowed to love. The system did not invent fear. It weaponized it. Actors learned early that talent was never enough. You could be brilliant, beautiful, unforgettable, and still disposable. What saved you was obedience. Silence. The willingness to let your life be edited the same way your films were. Scenes removed. Lines rewritten. Endings changed to please an audience you would never meet. Lavender marriages were simply the most visible evidence of that power. And for many, the most painful. Some stars carried their secrets with grace so convincing that even their closest friends believed the illusion. Others broke under the strain, turning to alcohol, rage, self-destruction. The emotional toll of living a divided life did not always show on screen, but it seeped into performances, into interviews, into that strange sadness audiences sometimes sensed without understanding why. Have you ever watched an old Hollywood romance and felt something ache beneath the surface? A look that lingered too long. A smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. That was the cost of pretending. The industry framed lavender marriages as solutions, but they solved nothing. They delayed pain. They redistributed it. They transferred suffering from studios to individuals and called it professionalism. And because the movies were beautiful, because the fantasy was intoxicating, the audience rarely questioned the machinery behind it. That is how systems survive, not through force alone, but through charm. What makes these stories resonate now is not just their shock value. It's their familiarity. Even today, public figures are still encouraged to soften their truth, to polish their edges, to become more marketable. The language has changed. The contracts are quieter. But the pressure remains. Old Hollywood may be gone, but its shadow is not. And that is why these stories matter. Not to expose. Not to judge. But to understand. Because when we finally acknowledge the hidden lives behind the legends, the films don't lose their magic. They gain depth. The romance becomes more poignant. The performances more brave. Knowing what these stars carried makes what they gave us even more extraordinary. They didn't just entertain. They endured. So the next time you hear a classic love theme swell, or see a perfectly staged wedding scene flicker across the screen, pause for a moment. Think of the real weddings, the quiet ones, the strategic ones, the painful ones. Think of the people who stood beneath the lights knowing the applause was for a version of themselves they were forced to play. Those were the real performances. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of lavender marriages is not that love was hidden, but that honesty was treated as something dangerous. Yet here we are now, speaking these names aloud. Telling these stories without whispers. Letting truth exist without apology. That, in itself, is a kind of justice. Because secrets thrive in silence. And history heals when it is finally allowed to speak. Old Hollywood's lavender marriages were built to disappear. But the people who lived them never did. And as long as their stories are remembered, their love, hidden, complicated, and real, was never truly lost. The strangest thing about lavender marriages is not that they existed. It's how normal they felt to the people trapped inside them. After a while, secrecy stopped feeling like a burden and started feeling like routine. Lies became schedules. Appearances became obligations. Love, real love, became something that had to be carefully rationed, experienced only in stolen moments, hidden apartments, or glances held just a second too long when no one was watching. For many actors, the performance never truly ended. They woke up as their public persona. They went to sleep as it. Even alone, even in silence, the fear of being discovered lingered like a second heartbeat. Hollywood did not need to threaten them every day. It had already taught them the consequences. And perhaps no story captures that quiet, grinding exhaustion better than the life of a man whose image was built entirely on desire. Someone sold as the ultimate object of fantasy, while being denied the freedom to want openly himself. Tyrone Power was one of the most sought-after leading men of his era. Women adored him. Men wanted to be him. His face promised danger softened by romance, strength balanced with vulnerability. Studios built entire films around his allure. But behind that image lived a man constantly negotiating who he was allowed to be. Power's private life was complicated, filled with relationships that seemed passionate on the surface yet collapsed repeatedly under strain. His marriages, highly publicized, intensely scrutinized, followed a familiar pattern. Intense beginnings. Public fascination. Private disintegration. And behind it all, persistent rumors the studios worked relentlessly to suppress. Whether every rumor was true matters less than how Hollywood reacted to them. The fear alone was enough. Power was encouraged to marry not once, but multiple times, as if repetition could drown out doubt. Each marriage became another layer of insulation between the public and the truth. But insulation also isolates. Those closest to him described a man deeply sensitive, searching, often unhappy. Fame gave him everything except peace. And peace, in Hollywood, was the one thing no contract could guarantee. What unites Tyrone Power with Rock Hudson, Cary Grant, Tab Hunter, Ramon Novarro, and Katharine Hepburn is not identity, it's the environment that shaped their choices. An industry that demanded clarity while creating confusion. That punished honesty while rewarding illusion. Lavender marriages were never about fooling the audience forever. They were about buying time. Another year. Another film. Another chance to exist without scrutiny. But time, eventually, runs out. As the studio system weakened, the carefully maintained structures collapsed with it. Gossip columnists grew bolder. Audiences grew more curious. The walls that once protected secrets began to leak. For some stars, this meant liberation. For others, it meant exposure they were never prepared to face. And for a few, it meant disappearance. The tragedy of Lavender marriages is not only in the love that was hidden, but in the love that was postponed indefinitely. Many actors believed they would live truthfully someday. After the next film. After the next contract. After retirement. Someday rarely came. Instead, what arrived was regret. Regret for the relationships never pursued. For the honesty never claimed. For the life that might have been lived if fear had not been institutionalized. And yet, judging these people by modern standards misses the point entirely. They were not cowards. They were navigating a system designed to break them if they stepped out of line. The choice was never between truth and comfort, it was between silence and annihilation. Hollywood did not ask politely. It demanded compliance. What makes these stories resonate so deeply today is not simply their sadness, but their relevance. We live in an age that celebrates visibility, yet still punishes deviation. We praise authenticity, yet still reward those who fit the mold most cleanly. The faces have changed. The contracts have evolved. But the pressure remains. Old Hollywood's Lavender marriages were an early warning, a glimpse into what happens when image becomes more valuable than humanity. And still, despite everything, something beautiful survived. Art. These actors gave performances layered with longing, restraint, and emotional depth that cannot be taught. Their pain sharpened their craft. Their secrecy infused their work with nuance. When they played love, they understood its cost intimately. Perhaps that is why their films endure. Because beneath the glamour, beneath the fantasy, there was truth, just not the kind Hollywood wanted to acknowledge. Now, as we reach the end of this story, it's worth asking what we owe them. We cannot undo their silence. We cannot restore the years they lost. But we can refuse to let their lives be reduced to scandal or trivia. Lavender marriages were not gossip, they were survival strategies in a world hostile to difference. And survival, even when imperfect, deserves recognition. So when the final frame fades and the music swells, let this be what remains. Not judgment, not pity, but understanding. These were people who loved deeply, even when love had to hide. Who endured extraordinary pressure so that audiences could believe in effortless romance. Who gave us beauty while carrying burdens we were never meant to see. Old Hollywood's Lavender marriages were built to protect an illusion. But the truth behind them, complex, painful, human, has outlived the lie. And now that truth belongs not to studios, not to contracts, but to history. And history, at last, is listening. There is one final illusion to dismantle before we let this story rest. The idea that Lavender marriages were cold, calculated arrangements between strangers who felt nothing for one another is comforting, but incomplete. Because the truth is far more unsettling. Some of these unions did not begin with indifference. They began with trust. With shared vulnerability. With the quiet promise that two people could protect each other in a world that would not. For a few, what started as strategy slowly transformed into something resembling love, not romantic in the traditional sense, but intimate in ways that mattered. They became confidants. Allies. The only people who knew the full truth and stayed anyway. And that kind of bond can be both beautiful and devastating. Imagine sharing your deepest secret with someone who must never reveal it. Imagine building a life with a partner who knows your real self, but can never publicly acknowledge it. Imagine loving someone enough to live a lie for them, and then realizing the lie has consumed you too. That is the emotional landscape Lavender marriages created. For every actor remembered as a legend, there is a partner whose name history barely whispers. A woman who attended premieres alone while standing beside a husband in public. A man who smiled beside a wife he could not touch, knowing that tenderness itself could be misinterpreted. These were lives lived in halves. And yet, the world called them privileged. What makes this history especially haunting is how carefully it was maintained. Studio executives were not villains twirling mustaches, they were businessmen. They justified every decision as necessary, every lie as protective. Careers were assets. Images were investments. People were interchangeable. The human cost was considered acceptable. Lavender marriages became part of a broader machinery designed to manufacture desire while suppressing reality. Hollywood did not simply reflect society's prejudices, it amplified them, Monetized them, and exported them worldwide. Millions learned what love looked like from people who were not allowed to love freely themselves. That contradiction is at the heart of this story. Because despite everything, these actors still found ways to connect. Some built chosen families. Some found long-term partners hidden from the public eye. Some poured their longing into art. And some, tragically, never found peace at all. The silence shaped them. It aged them. It followed them long after the cameras stopped rolling. Even in old age, many refused to speak openly, not because they feared exposure, but because the habit of hiding had become part of who they were. Silence, once a survival tool, became a prison. And then, slowly, the world changed. Not all at once. Not gently. But enough. Younger generations asked harder questions. Biographers dug deeper. Former stars, now beyond the reach of studio contracts, began to speak, not in anger, but in reflection. The truth emerged not as scandal, but as testimony. And what it revealed was not shame, but loss. Loss of time. Loss of possibility. Loss of lives that could have been lived more fully. Yet within that loss, there is also legacy. Because by understanding Lavender marriages, we understand the price of intolerance. We see how culture shapes identity, how power dictates intimacy, how fear can be systematized. These stories are not just about Hollywood, they are about what happens when any society values appearance over authenticity. And perhaps that is why they continue to resonate. They ask us uncomfortable questions. What are we still hiding? Who are we still asking to perform? And what illusions are we still protecting at the expense of real lives? Old Hollywood's Lavender marriages remind us that progress is not inevitable. It must be chosen, defended, remembered. And remembering is an act of respect. So as this story comes to a close, let it end not in sadness, but in recognition. Recognition of people who lived bravely in quiet ways. Who loved carefully. Who survived systems designed to erase them. They were more than rumors. More than scandals. More than carefully staged weddings. They were human beings navigating an impossible world with grace, pain, and resilience. And now, finally, their truth is no longer hidden behind studio doors or glossy photographs. It is here. It is spoken. And it deserves to be remembered. And before we truly let go, there is one last thing that must be said, because endings, like illusions, can be deceptive too. It would be easy to close this story with comfort. To say that time healed everything. That truth eventually fixed what silence broke. But history is rarely that kind. What time actually did was change the language. It allowed honesty to exist, yes, but it did not return what was taken. For many of the people who lived through Lavender marriages, freedom arrived after youth had passed, after opportunities for love had narrowed, after decades of emotional self-denial had already shaped who they became. Liberation came, but late. And late freedom carries its own grief. There are no photographs of that grief. No studio portraits of aging actors finally living openly, sitting quietly with the knowledge that their truest years were spent hiding. No magazine spreads showing the partners who waited patiently in the shadows, never introduced, never acknowledged, never thanked. Those moments happened off camera, where Hollywood never looked. And that is why this history matters, not as scandal, not as gossip, but as testimony. Because when we strip away the glamour, the contracts, the carefully written press releases, what remains is something deeply human. People trying to survive in a system that demanded they erase parts of themselves to be loved. Lavender marriages were never about fooling the audience alone. They were about convincing the actors themselves that this was the only way. That sacrifice was noble. That silence was strength. That survival was enough. But survival is not the same as living. Some stars carried that understanding quietly to their graves. Others spoke when they could, offering their truth not as accusation, but as warning. And what they warned us about was not Hollywood. It was what happens when any society decides that some kinds of love are acceptable and others are not. Because the real danger was never homosexuality. The danger was fear. Fear that made people marry strangers. Fear that made honesty feel fatal. Fear that taught generations to confuse performance with identity. Old Hollywood perfected the art of storytelling, but it failed to protect the storytellers. And yet, despite everything, something extraordinary survived: dignity. Even under relentless pressure, many of these actors chose kindness over bitterness. They protected their partners. They honored their agreements. They carried secrets not to deceive maliciously, but to preserve what little peace they could find. That does not excuse the system. but it honors the people. So when we look back now, clear-eyed, informed, no longer bound by the same rules, we owe them more than fascination. We owe them empathy. We owe them context. We owe them the dignity of being understood as more than myths. Rock Hudson was not just a tragic icon. Ramon Novarro was not just a cautionary tale. Cary Grant was not just effortless charm. Katharine Hepburn was not just fearless independence. Tab Hunter was not just a teenage dream. They were people navigating an impossible bargain. Give us your talent, your beauty, your youth, and in return, surrender your truth. Some refused quietly. Some complied painfully. None escaped unscarred. And yet, here we are, still watching their films, still moved by their performances, still believing in the emotions they brought to life. That, perhaps, is the final irony. The people who were denied authenticity on screen gave us some of the most authentic performances ever captured. Because they knew longing. They knew restraint. They knew what it meant to love carefully. And that knowledge bled into every frame. So as this story finally ends, let it end with intention. Not with nostalgia for a glamorous past, but with gratitude for the truth that survived it. Not with judgment, but with understanding. Not with silence, but with remembrance. Old Hollywood's lavender marriages were built to hide love. But love, even hidden, leaves traces. In the films we still watch. In the performances that still move us. In the stories we are finally brave enough to tell. And perhaps the most meaningful ending we can offer is this: the truth did not destroy the magic. It deepened it. Because now, when we look back, we don't just see stars. We see people. And that, at last, is real. And even after all the lights have dimmed, even after the cameras have stopped rolling and the studios have long since crumbled, the legacy of those lavender marriages lingers. It's in the way we still idolize old Hollywood, the way we still romanticize the silver screen, the way we still admire perfection without realizing the cost behind it. Every smile, every tender scene, every perfectly timed embrace carries an echo of restraint, an invisible heartbeat of longing that was never allowed to fully flourish. For the actors themselves, life was never truly private. Every glance could be analyzed, every word scrutinized, every gesture judged. They learned to love quietly, to grieve quietly, to live quietly, because the alternative was not only career ruin but public shaming and personal danger. In some cases, it was even worse: isolation so deep that the heart itself began to accept deception as a normal rhythm of existence. Yet, despite decades of secrecy, love found its way through cracks in the system. Friendships became lifelines. Partnerships offered silent understanding. Acts of courage, small and often invisible, allowed some semblance of genuine connection. Rock Hudson, despite the constraints of his marriages, carried with him a profound capacity for empathy and devotion. Tab Hunter, even while performing his public facade, forged meaningful relationships that would sustain him for life. Katharine Hepburn, fiercely independent, loved in ways that defied social norms, creating a private world where authenticity mattered more than appearance. And there were moments of poetry in the pain. Weddings that were not truly about romance became lessons in human endurance. They taught lessons about compromise, about empathy, about loyalty. In the shadows of deception, some actors learned to love with a careful balance of patience and self-preservation, a skill as intricate and demanding as any performance on screen. The world may have seen only the surface: flawless images, perfect narratives, the illusion of love captured in still frames. But the truth, the messy, human, profoundly emotional truth, was there all along. It was in the quiet letters, the subtle gestures, the fleeting moments of tenderness, the careful glances exchanged in private rooms. For those who lived it, that truth was both a burden and a lifeline. When we remember the names, Rock Hudson, Ramon Novarro, Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, Tab Hunter, we must remember more than the glamour. We must remember courage. We must remember the resilience required to maintain a life in which every choice, every relationship, every public smile was calculated for survival. And we must remember the invisible partners, the women and men whose lives were entwined in these arrangements, who bore the weight of secrecy with dignity, whose sacrifices allowed these stars to continue their performances without the public ever realizing the cost. Lavender marriages were more than Hollywood strategy. They were a reflection of a society afraid of difference, a culture that demanded conformity at the expense of humanity. And while the studios, the contracts, and the illusions may be gone, their impact remains. These stories serve as a warning that when love, identity, and truth are constrained by fear, even brilliance cannot thrive freely. And yet, there is hope in their legacy. By telling these stories, by honoring the hidden lives behind the silver screen, we reclaim a measure of the truth that was denied for so long. We remind ourselves that the cost of secrecy was not in vain. It shaped performances, it deepened emotion, it created art that resonates even today. So let the final image linger in your mind, a black and white wedding photo. A couple smiling under chandeliers, hands touching just enough to suggest love. Now imagine the private hearts behind that smile, the love that existed, hidden, unspoken, and resilient. Remember that every quiet sacrifice, every whispered secret, every forced smile, was a testament to the human capacity to endure, to protect, and to love under impossible circumstances. Old Hollywood's lavender marriages were never just stories of deception. They were stories of survival. Stories of courage. Stories of love, hidden, complicated, and beautiful beyond measure. And now, for the first time, those stories are finally allowed to be told. The lights may fade, the cameras may stop, but the truth remains. The love remains. The courage remains. And as long as we remember, their stories will never be lost again. And now, as the final curtain falls on old Hollywood's hidden romances, we are left with a truth more compelling than any screenplay ever written. Love, in its purest form, cannot be contained, not by contracts, not by fame, not by fear. The actors we've remembered, Rock Hudson, Ramon Novarro, Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, Tab Hunter, lived in a world that demanded performance, but even within that world, the human heart found ways to endure, to love, and to protect. Some marriages were born of necessity, some of strategy, some of survival. Some became quiet friendships that lasted decades, alliances forged in the crucible of secrecy. Some became prisons where desire was forbidden, yet where tenderness and loyalty quietly persisted. The lessons of these lives are stark, yet profoundly moving. Authenticity has a price, and yet, even hidden, love refuses to die. When we see those photographs, perfect smiles frozen under chandeliers, hands touching just enough to suggest intimacy, we must remember what they do not show: the stolen glances, the letters never sent, the nights spent longing in silence, the sacrifices made to preserve a career, a reputation, or even a single fragile piece of peace. Behind every image, behind every public gesture, there existed courage. Courage to endure, to survive, to protect, and to love even when it could not be declared. These stories remind us that the golden age of Hollywood was not simply a time of glamour and romance. It was a time of fear, of oppression, of hidden lives, yet also of incredible resilience, ingenuity, and devotion. The actors we admired on screen were more than legends. They were human beings navigating impossible circumstances, balancing survival with the ache of unspoken love. And the quiet partners, the wives and confidants, the friends who shielded secrets, were the unsung heroes of these stories, living lives intertwined with courage, heartbreak, and sacrifice. Lavender marriages were a system built to protect illusions, but in protecting those illusions, they revealed the profound power of hidden love. They show us that love does not always need applause, that devotion does not always require recognition, and that courage sometimes resides in silence. Even in an industry that demanded conformity, even in a world that punished difference, the human heart endured, and in doing so, left behind a legacy of depth, complexity, and beauty that still resonates today. As the story of old Hollywood fades, remember this: the greatest romances were not always the ones celebrated on screen. Some were hidden behind studio doors, whispered in quiet apartments, written in letters never sent, felt in glances no one witnessed. They were fragile, fleeting, and sometimes tragic, but they were real. And real love, even hidden, shapes the world in ways perfection never could. So the next time you watch a classic film, or see a perfectly staged wedding photo, pause for a moment. Look beyond the facade. Imagine the private hearts behind the smiles, the untold stories behind the glamour. Understand the courage, the pain, the devotion, the secrecy. Honor the love that survived in silence. And know this: while Hollywood tried to hide it, love always finds a way to leave its mark. Because in the end, old Hollywood's lavender marriages were not just stories of deception, they were stories of human endurance, resilience, and the unyielding power of love. And now, finally, those stories are free to be told.